Hey, so this is a video that's going to be encompassing a lot of issues, and I'm going to be talking about them in somewhat umbrella terms, somewhat of an umbrella context, because the sort of things that I want to talk about are very complex, and I think would really, if I was to look at them in greater detail, take up lots of videos. So I'm going to try and make this relatively compact, but at the same time try and fit in all the issues that I want to discuss. So I want to talk about opinions, views, and basically how we reach this, um, and the role the media plays, um, contextual experience, i.e., if someone is in a particular situation, how that experience formulates their views, and how, in my view, everybody on some level holds an inherent bias. So these are the issues I'm going to be looking at. I think they're very important in today's world. We live in a world that, needless to say, is more interconnected than ever before. And this has been something that has gradually seen decade to decade. We're living in the digital age, and arguably the internet and mass media are more powerful than any government or any individual on earth. Perhaps today's superpower is not the United States, is not China, is not Russia, but mass media, perhaps. I'm not saying yes or no, I'm just throwing that out there as a debate topic because I think that we cannot underestimate how powerful this sort of digital communication is, whether through the internet or through mass media. And by communication, I also mean information. Um, I'm not going to really use any case example for this video as something to hold up, although I'm sure I'll bring case examples into this. But I guess I'll use myself just as an example. I am someone who closely follows events going on in the world and events in society and debates in society and social political issues in general. Now, I would be a liar if I said that I was neutral on every subject. I certainly am not. I am absolutely hand on heart opinionated on a lot of issues. And it would be disingenuous of me to say otherwise. I have made almost 1,300 videos now on my channel. I've been very active on this channel, and a lot of those videos I am quite opinionated, and I'm putting forward views that I feel very strongly about. And I have no doubt that I will continue to do so after this video. So the purpose of this is not really to kind of hold back and think, oh, I should be neutral all the time. Rather, it's a sort of reflection that, yes, actually, I am just one example. I'm a personification of the fact that most people who make videos based on social or political issues are biased one way or another. Or if you don't like the term bias, let's say opinionated. Bias, I guess, could imply a lack of objectivity, and that's not necessarily the case. I think people have strong opinions whilst also having done research on a subject. So it's not necessarily a case that just because someone has strong views on something, they haven't listened to the other side. Um, but at the same time, I don't think it is possible for any human being, no matter how intelligent and no matter how open minded they are, to truthfully say that they are entirely objective on any given subject. Um, I think the only way that someone can reach a level of objectivity where they're really not bringing their own views into it is if they're apathetic to the subject. And therein lies a situation whereby the only way you could be that objective is by being apathetic. Because anyone who looks deeply into an important subject will at some point start to become, if not biased, opinionated. I'll quote an example. There's a British journalist. I think he may have partial Australian background, but he's a very well established journalist, Robert Fisk. He has written for The Independent for years. He's a very seasoned journalist. He's about 72 now, but he's abundant field experience from the Middle East. And I don't like to, I wouldn't like to be in a debate with the guy because he's a lot more informed about these issues than I am at this stage, put it that way. But I cannot help but feel that when I read his articles, his own sentiments are coming through with a lot of that. I mean, sometimes he talks in sarcastic terms like, um, we have to listen to our masters. He's talking about the British government. And I cannot help but feel that there is a cynical bias coming into that. Now, this might well be justified from his own experience, but I believe that experience does formulate views. And I know that from my own experience. My experience with crime has definitely given me a biased stance on crime. I take a hardline stance on antisocial behavior because I know what it's like. So, likewise, I think someone like Robert Fisk, the field experience that he has had, the things that he has seen, I think it would be very difficult for him not to have personal views on these issues. So that's where you get reporting that goes beyond just reporting the news. And actually, one of the great myths about reporting is that reporters, journalists should always be absolutely neutral. Actually, I don't necessarily have a problem with journalists bringing their own views into it, so long as it is clear that it is their own views. The problem becomes, and this isn't about Robert Fisk anymore, I'm talking about other issues now. The problem becomes when journalists aren't just sort of talking of their direct experience on the field, or if they're just offering their own views and making it clear that it is their own views, but then when they start to allow themselves to become tools of a government or a regime. And the truth of the matter is, there is no major media outlet in the world that can honestly claim to be neutral. None of them are neutral, none of them. Just to run down some of the well known organisations, the BBC frequently accused of having a left wing bias. CNN is frequently accused of having a liberal bias. Fox News is frequently accused of having a conservative Republican bias. Russia Today is accused of being a mouthpiece of the Kremlin. Chinese state media like CCTV, Xinhua, is frequently accused of being the mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party. And you could go on and on with this. Um, there is no network that will find itself escaping criticism in one form or another. And one reason for that is because a lot of the criticism is valid enough. I have defended networks when I feel that they have been doing their job and they've been attacked unfairly. But I've also always said that no network is entirely innocent in terms of being absolutely neutral. So I think there's a difference between individual journalists having an editorial or explicitly making it clear. For example, newspapers will often say opinion section. So they're making it clear that it is the opinion of the writers and not necessarily the editorial of the newspaper. And I think that's a very, very important thing to differentiate. Um, but the fact of the matter is, especially when it comes to geopolitical conflicts, what opinion you hear is very, very much going to be based on what side of the conflict the person is coming from. So, say, for example, you're speaking to two people. Let's look at an example, the Ukraine conflict, the Donbass conflict. If you speak to a pro West Ukrainian nationalist and you speak to a pro Moscow Crimea separatist, you're going to hear very, very different accounts of the situation. Now, if you're an outsider, who do you believe? This is a fundamental question because you're going to hear different perspectives. And I can give many other recent contemporary examples, or relatively recent. 2008, when there was the unrest in Tibet, I remember there was a video saying I can't remember if it was a video or if I think it was a video, not a Facebook page. Anyway, one video said Tibet has never been and never will be a part of China, and it had so many millions of views. Then there was another counter video saying Tibet has always been and will always be a part of China. So armed conflict nowadays, or even they even said actual war, and let's say sectarian conflict, is being fought just as much in cyberspace as it is on the actual battlefield or on the ground. And that is definitely a new development that we're seeing in the 20th century. And increasingly, I think this could be used by governments. Well, it already is, but I think increasingly so in the future. Israel Gaza is another example. Depending on what source you look at, you're either going to see an Israeli perspective or a Palestinian Arab perspective. Now, there are people who say, well, all the mass media, they're a bunch of liars, so I'm not going to listen to any of them. But incidentally, even this term mass media or mainstream media, to some extent, I even take issue with that terminology because I often hear people commenting on Fox News, distributors on Fox News preach about mainstream media. Well, they are the mainstream media because Fox News, it may have been established later than CNN, but it more or less is mainstream media now. Why? Because it basically is the voice of America's right. So how they can argue that they are sort of an underground rebellious network is a lot of nonsense. Fox News is extremely biased. It is basically the mouthpiece of the Republican right. And sure, CNN is biased as well. CNN is the mouthpiece of liberalism and so called progressives. So there's no such thing as mainstream media in this regard when you have big networks who claim that they're mainstream media. At least CNN and the BBC don't make any allusions to that. At least they don't claim otherwise. Fox, the thing that annoys me about Fox is they have this holier than thou attitude that they're somehow. I mean, any network that says that has to say they're fair and balanced is only saying that they aren't because every network's biased. And, for Fox News to claim that they're balanced is frankly nonsense. Even if you're a right winger or conservative minded, heart on, you have to put your hand on your heart and say Fox News is not neutral. It's just not. That's just one example. Likewise, Russia today has been very defensive when criticism has went in their direction. But look at their track record. Look at their track record. They cannot make a report about Britain or France or the United States without cynical overtones. Then you look at the track record of the BBC, you could say that they, within the UK context, they're very biased to the political left. And on the world context, you could say that I wouldn't say that the BBC carries a British nationalist agenda. I don't see that from the BBC. But bias, perhaps, you could say they carry a Western liberal bias. And certainly people in China and Russia would take that view. So I really do think that how we view situations in the world comes from perspective. Um, but I want to touch on the other issue then. Okay, so people take the view all the mainstream media, they're all biased. Okay, they've all got a political agenda. So what do people do? They start then getting into, let's say, kind of underground or alternative news sources. So they look at sites like InfoWars. But the problem is, by pertaining to be this idea of brave truth seekers and so on, they're actually only trying to vindicate their own preset bias. So people, for example, who are vociferously against the American government. They believe it's this big, overbearing, would-be dictatorship. They think of the NSA. They think of the military-industrial complex. They think of all these things. Uh, so they have this preset for right or wrong. They have this preset um, viewpoint about the American government. And I'm not saying they're wrong, by the way. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that the bias is there. So when I see channels like Infowars and so on, and they claim that they're only seeking the truth. I'm thinking, well, Really, what you're trying to do is vindicate your own preset belief. And perhaps the truth is we are all guilty of this. I mean, I will like videos that I agree with. That's the truth. And I think most people, if they're being absolutely candid about this, they are more likely to like a video because they agree with what the person is saying rather than because they know it 100% to be the truth. So I really do think that no one can claim to be all knowing. No one can claim that. Everyone is inherently biased on some level. So that's why I just don't get into sort of channels that are purporting to be truth finding and so on. And, you know, I know there is a place for whistleblowers and I know there is a place for investigative journalism. But sometimes you get the problem with conspiracy theorists is not that they're wrong about everything, it's that there is no sort of line of thinking, well, at what point are we just seeking the truth? And at what point are we trying to vindicate our own viewpoints? Because I have seen certain conspiracy theorists that will have an answer for everything. Every single thing is about the American government or the British government. And then I think, well, wait a second. Let's say, for example, you are absolutely 100% in favor of someone like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange, and you think they're real heroes. I have a more ambiguous view about those guys. On one hand, I think there should be a place for whistleblowers, but then you get into a situation of, well, if you really take their viewpoint to its absolute measure, then government should have no power whatsoever to have counterterrorism surveillance and so on. And if that is really the line you want to go on, then you have to accept the consequences of a society that is basically going down an anarchist path. So I maintain that a certain degree of power is absolutely necessary. I am not pro anarchist. I do not believe that government shouldn't have some degree of power. So when you get people kind of getting on their moral high ground and saying that government should be afraid, people shouldn't, of course, people shouldn't be afraid, but that doesn't mean that the government is the enemy. And I don't accept this sort of approach that we should always view governments as the enemy. Governments should be servants of the people, but that doesn't mean that it should be a situation of animosity. I don't think it's healthy to promote constant cynicism. I don't think it's healthy to promote this idea that all governments are evil and all governments only want to keep people down and so on. I think that's a lot of nonsense. By the same token, I am very, very wary of totalitarianism, um, and I absolutely defend the right for people to question governments. But people who are come out with lines like governments should be afraid, people shouldn't, and talking in the context of parts of the world where there is such a concept as right to protest. In those situations, I think what they're basically calling for is anarchy. In other parts of the world where there are uprisings and so on, people don't want anarchy. They want government, they want rule of law, they want human rights, they want all of these important things. But what they really want is transparency. And I think this is one of the most critical issues when it comes to what the global direction is going in. Of course, I can't say that every situation's the same, but I think if you look at the fundamental underlying argument of pretty much every protest, more or less, in the world over the last, let's just look at this decade, let's say since 2010, look at all the major global movements there's been. The Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, the Euromaidan. You can argue that there is political agendas behind these things, and of course there are. Politics is always going to be a factor. And of course, there will be players involved in all of these things that have their own agenda. But if we're going to talk about people power, there is a theme in all of these situations, and that theme is more or less calling for greater transparency. Even in countries that have a single party system, you'll find that people generally are a lot more questioning than they used to be. In a country like China, for example, China today remains a single party state, but it is not the China of the 1960s where you have unquestioning brainwashed ants, to put it in a crude way. However, one difference I would make with democracy and single party states is that I would argue there is more transparency in democracy by nature. And I will argue quite passionately about this. Why? Okay, that's a follow up question. Why? The reason is quite simple. If you have a single party that controls everything, so they're in government, they absolutely control the media, they control the courts, they control the legislature, they control everything. The chances of transparency are going to be massively reduced because there will always be the situation of protecting their own. Now, of course, you can find examples of this within democratic systems. So you could argue that there is double standards in terms of, let's say, a peer in the House of Lords not facing justice in the way that a regular person would, just as an example. But at least in this situation, you have the existence of critical media who can question that. People can make YouTube videos freely without fear of persecution. Although we have to be very careful about this, and it will say that although I believe the situation in democratic countries is much better, that doesn't mean we should be complacent. I should really at this point talk a little bit about democracy because I know there are people out there who will kind of scoff and say, oh, we don't have a democracy. The point is this: we do have a democracy actually, but it is a flawed democracy. And maybe the nature of democracy is always meant to be flawed. The point about democracy is not and never has been about getting exactly what you want. That's a very childish outlook. It's never been about that. It has been about choice, and it has been and should be about transparency. Choice and transparency. Those are the two underlying themes of democracy, not getting exactly what you want. Because if that was the case, then how are you ever going to have a situation where 65 million people, just to give the UK as an example, are in agreement? You'll never get it. So I think the public need to be basically understanding of the fact that you will never absolutely have everything you want. You just won't. Otherwise, what you're really asking for is a utopia. It doesn't exist. And no ideology in the world will bring about such a utopia. And by the way, anarchy sure as hell won't. So I think context is extremely important. If I have a choice between living in a flawed democracy or a perfect totalitarian system, I choose the flawed democracy because actually what comes to mind is Aeon Flux. If you've seen the futuristic film Aeon Flux, now on the surface, everything looks really clean and nice. And it's really, everything's wonderful. But beneath the surface, there's actually a totalitarian system going on. It reminds me of the REM song, Shiny Happy People. There's a lot of allusions to the fact that song was supposedly written in reference to Tiananmen Square. There's some debate over whether it was or not, but whatever the case, it was released shortly after the Tiananmen Square crackdown, and there is a sort of urban theory that they wrote it to kind of mockingly satirize the attitude of the Chinese government that nothing had happened, which is still their attitude today. I mentioned at the start of the video that people are always going to be influenced by their surroundings, and I think that's very true. I think nationalism is another thing that comes into this, and okay, I'm expanding out a bit here, but I think it is necessary to mention this. I honestly believe that most people, I would say 80% of people, are instinctively nationalistic on some level. Now, I believe you get neo nationalism, which I have attacked. I believe it's an ugly, ugly thing based on tribal mindsets. But I still think that inherently in most people, there is a sort of instinctive response to defend one's nation when they feel it is under attack, either in terms of its reputation or its, you know, criticism from outside. It's almost like you could argue with someone in your family, but if an outsider attacks them, you'll still defend them. Something like that. So I think that's the mindset of a lot of Chinese nationals. They will always say, "Oh, but we don't we're not members of the Chinese government," but they'll still go out of their way to make a very passionate, sometimes aggressive defense of the Chinese government's reputation. Um, and you see this all over the world. People just don't like to listen, hear their country being criticized. Doesn't matter if it's the truth; they just don't like to hear it. I think, therefore, that inherent nationalism also comes into this. And that might present a gloomy picture because it's a very tribal thing. I think it takes a real ability for people to be absolutely objective on these matters. And I do think that circumstances matter. You know, my opinions as a Westerner, if I had been born in China, just as an example, if I had been born in Russia, would I have a different outlook on the world? Quite possibly. Quite possibly. And it's not a case that I would be necessarily right or wrong in those things. It's to do with circumstance. And I think all that we can do as human beings is try to garner as much information as possible. I don't agree with those who say, oh, the media is all full of shit, so don't listen to any of them. The reason I don't agree with it is because if you're saying you can only find out from first-hand experience, well, that's ridiculous. Because how can you find out, for example, how can you have an opinion on something like the war in Syria if you're not on the ground? And the vast majority of us will not be in a situation where we would be on the ground unless we're a journalist or an aid worker. So, in other words, we have no choice but to. Of course, you could just not care. That's why a lot of people don't, they don't like politics and they don't like geopolitical situations and they try to avoid it. Actually, I totally understand such people. And I respect that. I understand it. But at the same time, even those people would still find themselves becoming nationalistic if the country's reputation is under attack. So most people are going to have opinions on certain subjects. And it isn't even about geopolitics, it can also be internally, issues like gay rights or euthanasia or whatever it might be, abortion, hot topic social issues. Those sort of things, again, can come from your own upbringing, if you're from a religious background, if you're not, if, all of these things come into play. So I really think that none of us, we have to just accept that we will never ever know everything. So there's nothing wrong with sitting on the fence with certain subjects. There's this kind of expectation that we always have to have an opinion on everything. Sometimes there really isn't anything wrong with sitting on the fence. I don't think it's cowardice. Obviously, it's harder for politicians because they're expected to take a view. But for those of us who aren't involved in the political arena, I think all we can really do is garner as much information as possible, listen to different viewpoints on any given subject, reflect on those viewpoints carefully, and reach your own conclusion with that. And I think that experience does matter. You can't ignore experience. If you've been a victim of crime, that is going to shape your experience on crime. If you've been in the armed forces, it's probably going to shape your views on armed conflict. And I could give many other examples. And I guess the downside to this is that it then leads to confrontation because you'll see an opinion that you just can't attach to. You just can't understand the other person's point of view. And I do have respect for people who have the ability to always kind of be always seek to avoid confrontation. I sort of understand that. But at the same time, there is something to be said for conviction and standing up for your conviction. I don't think that means you have to get into confrontation and arguments, but it's very, very, very important that when we stand by our conviction is coming from a place that we have thought it through. It doesn't mean we have to know everything about the subject, but at least have thought it through and at least have listened to the other point of view. So I'm going to round this up. What I would say to anyone, no matter where you are in the world watching this, step back for a second. Consider where you are. Consider, just try to step outside the circle. And I'm talking about myself as well here. And when I'm talking about the circle, I'm talking about familiarity. I'm talking about what country you're in, what information you listen to, and what other people you are influenced by. And I'm not saying reject those things, but I'm saying just experiment. Step outside of it. Just step outside what you think you know and try and consider the other points of view. And then if you still think, well, I've listened to that and they're wrong, then stand up for your conviction. I think as human beings, we can't do anything else except garner as much information as possible and form our views. And it's also important, by the way, to show some humility. I never, ever, ever see someone as weak if they're apologizing for something or if they're retracting. Some people sort of think, oh, they've exposed themselves or they're weakened. I don't think so. I think that's strength. Same applies to nation states. That's why it's so important for nation states to confront their past and be honest about their past. I think it's actually a mark of insecurity that countries like China are so frightened of letting people discuss controversial events in their history. I'm just using that as an example because there is mass heavy censorship of historical events. You know, even talking about these things, my bias will be coming through and I don't deny it. Someone recently accused me of not being as open minded as I think. Well, the point is, I have never ever claimed to know everything. But I can honestly say, hand on heart, that when I reach views on a particular subject and when I come out with strong views, I have looked at the other side. That's not the same as knowing everything, but at least I've reflected on the other side's point of view. I've tried to look at it from their point of view, and I think that's all you can do. But all of these things, media, nationalism, experience, come into it. And with that, I'll round this up. Thank you for watching.